Okay, we had ended with the landing of those 3,500. I'm sorry, we had ended with the draft, some of the discussion of those points, and we need to kind of take over with the landing of those 3,500 Marines that we had shared earlier, and the image that we had of that were those Marines and their equipment kind of landing on a beach, but that's not going to cut it when you're going to eventually have at the height of the Vietnam War in early 1969. You're going to have 540,000 plus American military personnel in South Vietnam, laying and stuff on beaches or in a few airfields. That's not going to be enough to cut the kind of logistics that are needed. You're seeing a picture here of Cam Ranh Bay in South Vietnam. This is one of the best, greatest natural deep water ports in the world, but you still have to build the port facilities to support it. Okay. And Vietnam had some pretty good harbors throughout the country, and the United States is going to build facilities for 6 deep water ports throughout the country. And really, in the course of 1965, General William Westmoreland, the top U.S. commander in Vietnam, he's going to be criticized for a number of different things in Vietnam. His overall strategy, his approach to Vietnam is pretty flawed in a lot of ways. And he's facing, look, to be fair, he's facing a lot of challenges, but the part that he did a pretty exceptional job with is the logistical approach, the challenge of moving the U.S. military personnel from all over the world to a country that wasn't ready to tackle this. I mean, we did not have the logistical infrastructure here in South Vietnam, and he's going to make it happen. 180,000 American troops are going to be in South Vietnam by December, from March to December of 1965. They're going to be in the country. That's pretty remarkable. They build 75 tactical airfields in the course of this conflict. They're going to have 26 major hospitals that are built within the country to support military hospitals, a dense road network up and down South Vietnam. Dozens upon dozens of significant permanent bases are going to be there, not the kind of temporary bases that you're going to see maybe in movies and that kind of thing, but we're talking permanent bases. You're going to have, to go along with that, 357 American libraries are going to be built there, 159 basketball courts, 71 swimming pools, 55 softball fields, 30 tennis courts, 2 bowling alleys, 40 ice cream plants, and a partridge in a pear tree. The U.S. and the military definitely like some creature comforts, and a lot is going to be built in Vietnam to go along with the military infrastructure that we talked about a minute ago. So anyway, so when we're talking the logistics part, that's what we're talking about there. So when we already mentioned the whole gradual escalation piece, it goes from 180,000 troops. It's going to kind of go from there. We're trying to avoid kind of what happened with Korea as well, with gradual escalation, about limiting the risks of bringing communist China into this conflict. We're going to be careful not to bring American troops into North Vietnam. We don't want the communist Chinese crossing that border. There are communist Chinese assisting North Vietnam, not just with supplies, but helping with the Ho Chi Minh Trail, for example. Some engineers there helping with their integrated air defense network, for example. That kind of thing on their soil, in their port facilities, these kinds of things kind of on the down low. But we're concerned, we're trying to limit the risks with those kinds of things. But we're trying to still reach an ouch point with that, depending on a huge amount of air power to do those things. We're also, with gradual escalation, we have, under McNamara, Secretary of Defense, we have what we feel we're going to reach a crossover point for the communists. That there'll be a point that we inflict so many losses on the communists, on the North Vietnamese army, on the Viet Cong. Remember, the Viet Cong would be the South Vietnamese communists. Okay, so the insurgents there in the South fighting with them, kind of farmer by day, Viet Cong, terrorist, insurgent by night, that will inflict so many losses on them that they can't replace them, that will hit that kind of a crossover point with body count, with that kind of a thing. We never truly hit that point because they're able to limit whenever they take too many losses, they're able to back off. The communists are able to control the tempo of the conflict, because the United States is not taking the war to the communists, for example, in the North, or for the most part into Laos or Cambodia. We do go into Cambodia once in 1970, in major force going after their sanctuaries. We send the South Vietnamese into Laos in 1971, but and look, there are covert operations at different points in time. We depend on a lot on bombing, but for the most part, the tempo is controlled. If it gets too intense, they're able to retreat, go underground, and that's going to be major things so that they're able to avoid any kind of a potential crossover point. Okay, so you think about this next piece about winning hearts and minds. I just want us to actually, you know what, we're going to skip over this part here. Let's go to this one here, and then we'll come back to the winning the hearts and minds and pacification. You're looking at here the spraying of Agent Orange. So just to reinforce that, and Operation Ranch Hand, we saw this image here. Okay, defoliants. Okay, and we had looked at that image at the beginning of Tuesday. Only you can prevent a forest from our friend Smokey the Bear. The United States sprayed somewhere between 11 and 19 million gallons of Agent Orange, and others. There was Agent Blue and Agent White, Agent Orange, because the name just came from the striping that was on the barrels. These different chemicals that were defoliants to kill the vegetation. This was primarily to deny cover. You had these triple canopal jungles that the enemy were able to hide under and hide their movements, that kind of thing. And by destroying the vegetation, it would be easier to find them, easier to bomb them, that kind of thing. It did destroy and kill vegetation, kill food supplies in some cases, but the primary thing was about destroying their cover. 6 million plus acres were sprayed with this. That's 20% of South Vietnam. Again, we were spraying this on our ally. Parts of other, like Laos, parts of it did hit Laos, that kind of thing, but overwhelmingly it was used on South Vietnam. This, we mentioned earlier, was a pure Michigan. Like, a lot of this was made in Michigan. Dow Chemical was one of the chemical companies. DuPont was another one, but Dow was one. So pure Michigan. But just to keep that one in mind. Obviously, a long-lasting effect of that, a legacy of that. You had Vietnam veterans that were impacted long-term health-wise from this. There was a settlement with these companies long after the Vietnam War to get some health treatment, some assistance, but you had some deaths and that kind of thing with some limited liability, but some payments to families and to veterans there. But honestly, you had long-term birth defects linked to this for American families, but honestly as well, the greatest impact around people that were living in Vietnam afterwards. You still have heavy environmental damage in some of these areas. You have areas of Vietnam that are more toxic than they were back in the 60s when this had been sprayed. It just really didn't go away. The water supply, that kind of thing, because it stayed with the water and moved with the water. So especially around the U.S. bases. Okay. All right. So we got that. Let's go back to this one, the whole idea about the winning the hearts and minds and then search and destroy and other choices. The You look at this picture. I mean, what little kid is not going to want to have a rooster? But this idea of winning the hearts and minds, and then the term of pacification. Um, the idea of pacification is a definition of a U.S. policy. You've got a hostile population in this viewpoint in the South of, viewing the entire population as potentially being hostile. The Viet Cong was hiding within it. Okay. So they're at least potentially hostile, and they are, that the morale and their, their viewpoint, you want them on your side, or at least you want them in control. Okay. Under your control, you want them, on your side, however you want to view it. Okay. So they are a primary and or secondary objective of the war itself. Okay. You want to take on the enemy, but you also need the population in the area that you're at is going to be an objective, and that's pacification. And so pacification is kind of an umbrella term. So it's military, okay, as far as what you're going to be doing militarily, economically, politically, all these activities. They may be done to protect that population. It can be to control them, to coerce them, to appease that population that is being besieged, attacked, coerced by the insurgency themselves or by an external threat. So the insurgents, the Viet Cong, the people from the South that are communists, but the external threat are North Vietnamese. The North Vietnamese army, they are sending people down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they're doing the same thing to the South Vietnamese population. So when we're saying military, economic, and political activities might mean building schools to help educate and work with the population. It could be digging wells and building bridges to help these villages. It could be building and working with the population to help them protect them from these threats. But you're also going to have military operations taking on the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese in these areas. And some of these things conflict with one another. You're going to have the intense fighting is going to happen in these rural areas, which is where the bulk of the South Vietnamese population lived, is in the rural parts of South Vietnam. And so the bombing that's going on, the artillery strikes that are going on, are out where the rural population lives. And so some of these, you're trying to win hearts and minds with these operations to dig wells, to improve the healthcare clinics and things like that, and vaccination programs and things like that to help them, and schooling and education programs. You're doing those things while bombing campaigns are happening. Economic programs, building bridges so that you can have more trade with these villages to raise economic activity. But while campaigns are going on, killing villagers in these areas too. And that's not to say, by the way, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese are brutalizing these regions as well. Okay. This whole pacification program fought quite often some of the objectives and operations, neither hand necessarily knowing what the other one's doing, or necessarily at times caring what the other hand is doing. You had civilians and military personnel involved in both of them. Okay, you had military personnel that were doing some of those education programs and economic programs in addition to military programs. We'll talk about one of them specifically. Again, handing out aid, okay, food programs, education programs here, okay, with children. Again, military personnel doing some of the healthcare. Okay. And one of these, this part was a Marine program, but they also had Army equivalents, these mobile action teams. But the Kindergarten Marines, and there's a really good book by a guy named Bing West about his combined action platoon. The Kindergarten Marines, this was a group that, so he was talking about his one operation. They had 485 days that they were in a village. Okay. There were 15 Marines. They were all volunteers. This was a particular pacification program. Okay. Their operation was to go into a village, into really to a few villages that they were with, and they were to recruit and work with what were called popular forces. So think of them as almost the equivalent of a militia, okay, of a very basic kind of guard, okay, to recruit them, to train them. Okay, so these Marines are there. And this image right here of, let's see, we got 3, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 14. So there's 17 men there in that picture, mixed of Marines and popular forces that are there. Okay. And in that photo, this was this whole thing of these combined action platoons. You are living in that village away from the other Americans. Okay. You're living in the village. There's 15 Marines, you got 30 popular forces. They're all sleeping in a local schoolhouse. Okay, that's where their barracks are. And you're eating what they eat. Okay. You're living amongst the people. They've had some training with language and that kind of thing. Okay, a little bit of extra training. They have no night vision, okay, with them. When they go out on patrol, they're not wearing helmets or flak jackets because they're worried about noise and that kind of thing, because they're going on night ambushes and that kind of thing. They're doing counterinsurgency. They're trying to go out and hit the Viet Cong and do ambushes against them. It's estimated that we're more than 100 Viet Cong in these villages that they were operating in. There were 5 hamlets. The hamlet is a village. Okay. There were about 5,000 villagers in this area that they were in. So there are 15 Marines, 30 popular forces to guard 5,000 villagers. They're there for 485 days. They did not call in artillery or airstrikes to aid in their fight because it would be calling it in on their heads and on the villagers' heads. Okay, the places where they're living. Okay, and that would be defeating the purpose. Okay, they ate what the villagers ate, what the popular forces ate, which was actually better than what they were getting. Okay, because they would have had to carry everything in sea rations and that kind of thing that would have been back from just right after the Korean War. So they ate, and they said that they ate better than the regular American forces for the most part ate. Okay, it was fresh food. In the course of that year, they ended up rooting out the Viet Cong were either all killed or fled. So it was a 485 days, so about a year and 3 months or so. In that picture that you're seeing in front of you, 4 of those guys were wounded, 9 were killed. So they sustained heavy losses. This was a dangerous job, which makes sense, right? They don't know who all of it. Now the villagers, as a result of seeing what the Americans are doing, seeing the risks that they're taking, seeing that they're not calling in these airstrikes, the artillery strikes, that they're bleeding next to them, that they're trustworthy. Okay. And these Marines were highly motivated. Okay. They had volunteered to do this. Okay. They were in it. The villagers, they gained the trust of the villagers. The villagers began giving information. We know that is one of the Viet Cong, that kind of thing. They, as time went on, it became much more successful. It gained momentum. And so that's why it became easier as that year plus went on. In the course of this whole thing, the combined action platoons, this lasted 3.5 years. Eventually they're not, by the way, this particular kindergarten Marine, the Big West one that he was in, it wasn't the first one. Okay. It was early on in the campaign, but it wasn't the first one. There were 114 platoons eventually in the course of this over 3.5 years. They ended up protecting 800 hamlets. 500,000 South Vietnamese, 0 hamlets, where eventually, once the platoons would secure a hamlet, the platoon would move on. The popular forces would protect it from then on. No hamlet was ever retaken by the Viet Cong, okay, until the end of the war, when the communists took everything over. So this was it time intensive? Yes. Okay. But it was a pretty successful program. Okay. So that's an example of a pacification effort. But again, the bombing and the artillery is also a pacification effort. All of these, it's a pretty big umbrella. Okay. That, by the way, the Kindergarten Marines, that's another one of the Vietnam 67 stories. Okay. This is an example here too. Look at, in the result of all that heavy sustained bombing out in the countryside, more than a third of the country, by the time it's 1968, more than a third of Vietnam was refugees. They had fled the countryside because of becoming orphans or losing one parent or just fleeing the bombing and were going into the cities. The cities were becoming overrun. You had entire new communities of just the homeless with temporary shelters. Got here, 2 children living on the street begging, okay, because of this. Pretty devastating commentary. Think about in the United States, where look, there are homeless in the, arguably the wealthiest country, not arguably, it is the wealthiest country in the world. But if we had 110, 115 million homeless, okay, that's the scale of the problem we're talking about. You already had this. Okay, an example here is this Into the Dragon's Jaw. The Dragon's Jaw, this was a heavily defended part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, road network coming out of North Vietnam, where a lot of the traffic went. The United States tried to do some pretty heavy bombing. One of the tales on the Vietnam 67 stories that I shared with you kind of discusses some of the problems of hitting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So this was, they kept bombing, and they were never able to take out the bridge network that was here until, when we think about technology, the first smart bombs were used during the Vietnam War. So the United States developed the first smart bombs, limited numbers, laser guided, precision guided missiles during this conflict. Small numbers of them, small percentages. Most were dumb bombs during this conflict. But and you can see the Dragon's Jaw got hit. The bridge was taken out. And you think about technology in general during this conflict, there were a lot of big innovations that happened here. But this is Cambodia. This is bombing sites that were bombed in Cambodia. 2.7 million tons of bombs during the war in Vietnam. Laos and Cambodia, the 2 countries bordering South Vietnam and North Vietnam. That's where the Ho Chi Minh Trail went down. Laos had 3 million tons of bombs that hit it. So we had, between South Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, far more bombs being dropped, tonnage, than you had on Europe and Japan during World War II, on not industrial countries, okay, rural countries, okay. And to limited effect. It was estimated in Vietnam that it took $10 in bomb to do $1 in damage. Now, the United States is willing to spend, okay, to do damage, especially if it prevents the loss of American lives, but it's just a thing of limited effectiveness of air power in some of these cases. So just thinking about the thoughts on technology, this quote from the CIA director, Richard Helms here. Before the bombing, so when the United States escalated our bombing on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the communists, used to send 3 men south to get 2 in place. Now they send 5. We're willing to lose planes. They're willing to pay in manpower. So it doesn't make a particle of difference. There just are more dead bodies. But in terms of net result, it doesn't make a damn bit of difference. This idea, we have an escalation on both sides, But the end result is the communists are getting the people in place that they need to continue to fight. Air power was not having that impact. And again, if you read the Vietnam 67 article, that pilot talked about that very same problem, that they couldn't close the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Got this one right here. We are going to stop. We're going to stop here with this one. There will be one final recording.